Well, good morning. This is the Lew Rockwell Show, and how great to have as our guest Mr. Will Grigg. I think of Will as the great expert on the American police state, the American Homeland Security state. I mean, the whole apparatus of that sort. He publishes the Pro Libertati blog, the Pro Libertati radio program he's host of. He's the author of 5 books, most recently Liberty in Eclipse, The War on Terror, and the Rise of the Homeland Security State. He produces the Liberty Minute, a daily 1-minute commentary, and of course we're going to link to all these things. Will, what are the latest horror stories? What are these people doing to us?
Lou, what's happening is that the artificial distinction between private sector crime and the government-sanctioned monopoly on crime is being effaced. And one really good illustration of that is something that happened just a few days ago in a minuscule town in Arkansas called Sulphur Springs. And that title is one of God's little jokes, I suppose, because this is certainly a malodorous development. There's a fellow by the name of Coleman Brackney, and like many other police officers, he has a middle name in quotation marks, Coleman Duke Brackney. He was appointed to be the police chief in Sulphur Springs, which is a hamlet of fewer than 500 people, I believe. They have one police officer now between 2010 and 2013 that enjoyed the blessing of being a police-free community, if you will. And they don't have any measurable crime rate, which begs the question of why it would be supposedly necessary to have a police department of any size. Mr. Brackney has an interesting set of qualifications for this position because a couple of years ago he was sent to jail for murdering somebody. Now, he wasn't prosecuted for murder. He wasn't prosecuted for criminal homicide. He was prosecuted for negligent homicide as the result of a car chase that ended with the person he was pursuing with his car in a ditch, and Mr. Brackney approached the car, slammed on the windows and kicked the side of the car, demanding that the motorist exit the vehicle. And when he got no response, he fired 5 shots into the front of the victim, a man by the name of James Ahern, and then went around behind the car and shot him again once in the back. He shot 6 slugs into this guy. One of the entry wounds was in the back. And then, as he was trained to do, he lied about what he had done. The dash cam video documented that he was never in danger. Officer Brackney, at the time he worked for Bella Vista, which is another very small town in Arkansas, claimed that the motorist had tried to run him down with the car, but the dash cam video made it pretty clear that he was never in danger. So he was arrested and then charged with 2 felonies, but the felonies were reduced to a misdemeanor of negligent homicide, and that charge, of course, assumes that it was not his intention to kill the victim. He was found guilty of that misdemeanor. He spent 1 month in jail, paid a $1,000 fine. The victim's family was compensated out of a taxpayer-funded settlement to the tune of $20,000. And then after spending a month in jail, Mr. Brackney went before the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission in the state of Arkansas, which I believe is a sanctioning body at least as credible as those responsible for giving licenses to professional wrestling referees. And he was allowed to keep his peace officer certification. And so he started looking for a job. And on Monday of this week, Mr. Brackney was appointed to be the police chief of Sulphur Springs. And displaying the talent for self-preoccupation that characterizes so many other police officers, he said this was his personal triumph, that he had promised his associates in Arkansas law enforcement that when he went to jail, he would be back. And there he was once again in a government-issued costume with a piece of costume jewelry invested with the supposed authority to detain people, to steal their property, and to kill them at his discretion. This is pretty typical of what goes on in Arkansas, because in the state of Arkansas, you can be a police officer simply for asking for a job with the police department. There really are no qualifications that are binding on people who carry state insignia and exercise the supposed authority of the state. In the state of Arkansas, in order to become a hairdresser, you have to have 2,000 hours of specialized instruction. According to the state licensing board, I believe you can become a manicurist if you log 900 hours of instruction, that is to say some kind of supervised classroom instruction and perhaps some kind of apprenticeship. To become a police officer, you can simply show up at a police department. If somebody's willing to give you a badge and a gun, you can defer your actual certification process by up to a year and a half. And Arkansas is just riddled with tiny towns of hundreds of people where there are police departments that are filled with people who, in my opinion, are veritable sociopaths with badges. And I think if you want to see a portrait of Dorian Gray, if you will, of what really goes on in the American law enforcement culture, Arkansas is as good a place to look as any.
As you would point out, Arkansas is hardly alone, even if their sort of regulatory system is maybe unique. Aren't these the kinds of people who are coming into so-called law enforcement everywhere? I mean,
yes.
And also the Iraq veterans, the Afghani veterans who may have PTSD or whatever, and they've maybe been damaged. And they're also taught that any civilian is a potential terrorist, a view that they seem to carry back here. Isn't this just police work, period, these days?
That's exactly right. What happens is that the system selects for that personality type. And it really doesn't help the public when they are certified, when they go through post-training, that is to say peace officer standards and training education by the post academy of a given state. What happens, of course, is that they're marinated in doctrines that impress upon their minds, first of all, the ubiquitous threat to officer safety that characterizes their profession. These people are trained to look upon the public as a threat to be neutralized and controlled rather than tax victims, or as we're referred to in official literature, taxpayers, who are their social superiors. We're looked upon as people who are part of a 360-degree battlefield. That's true of police officers or not. They're people who have actually had combat experience overseas. What happens is that they're reinforced in those views, and then they're given this perspective in which they see themselves as an elite tribe that is stationed among the rest of us who are lesser beings without the law, or mundanes as I refer to them in my writing. And their job is not to protect our property and our persons, but rather to make sure that we conform to their directives. And the highest prime directive, if you will, of law enforcement is officer safety. There was a really remarkable statement that was captured on video a couple of months ago in Emeryville, California. The police chief in Emeryville, a man by the name of Ken James, was speaking on behalf of various civilian disarmament initiatives and describing the menace that armed citizens pose to his officers, and the fact that anytime they encounter a gun, they find themselves very stressed out and concerned for their safety. Chief James said the following: "A gun is not a defensive weapon. That is a myth. A gun is an offensive weapon used to intimidate and used to show power. Police officers do not carry a gun as a defensive weapon to defend themselves or their other officers. They carry a gun in order to do their job in a safe and effective manner and face any opposition that we may come upon. If it was a defensive measure, why did we lose 55 officers nationwide last year to gun violence? We deal with gun violence on a daily basis." What he's saying, of course, is that police officers are in the business of employing gun violence in order to force people to submit. They don't perceive armed citizens as people who are defending their person and property against criminal violence. They perceive them as threats to themselves. And the reason why they carry guns, as Chief James pointed out, was to compel us to submit to their demands. And I think it's very rare that you find such a pure and unabashed expression of the ethos that a police officer represents. They exist to act to the state in the same way that the edge acts to the knife. That's an expression that a sociologist used a number of decades ago, that the police are to the state as the edge is to the blade. And the other thing that people need to recognize about the way that law enforcement operates is that we don't have a system in which they see themselves as peace officers. That is to say, people who are there to supplement our natural right to defend ourselves against violence, and where necessary to intervene to protect the innocent against criminal aggression, because there is no legal or civil requirement that a police officer has to protect a given citizen against the threat of criminal violence. This is something that has been repeatedly pointed out by the Supreme Court and other federal courts. In other words, they don't have any responsibility to come to your aid if you're being mugged or if you're being menaced by a rapist or somebody who seeks to kill you. And if they are delinquent in carrying out that function, chances are police officers can survive with their careers intact. However, if they decline an opportunity to extract revenue at gunpoint or to enforce some other positivist decree by the political elite, chances are they're not going to last long in that profession.
You know, it's interesting. Something else that we can learn from that guy's statement is just how safe a job policing is.
Exactly.
I mean, it's, of course, terrible anybody dies before their natural time. But if we think of commercial fishermen or loggers or miners or farmers these jobs are far more dangerous than being a cop, or for that matter, far more dangerous than being a soldier.
That's true.
The idea that they're under threat, is obviously has an important psychological impact for them and to make them as rotten as they are. But it's, of course, just not true. It's a myth. It's a lie.
Just a couple of days ago, there was a mining disaster in Utah that claimed the lives of a number of people who were involved in extracting wealth from the earth. These are people who are the producers of original wealth. They're actually enhancing the quality of life for people who live in Utah and elsewhere. And yet we're not going to see this bizarre spectacle of a Brezhnevite state funeral in recognition of the genuine sacrifice made by these people who were engaged in peaceful commerce. A couple of years ago, actually I believe it was 2011, it might have been early 2012, there was a huge state funeral in Utah for an officer who was involved in a no-knock SWAT raid against a fellow by the name of Matthew David Stewart, who was accused of growing marijuana on his own property. He was not accused of trafficking in the substance, as if engaging in that kind of commerce were innately bad. It's something the state prohibits, but it is not for that reason something that is immoral. But you had a large contingent of police officers who were undercover narcotics officers. They were straggly haired and they had scraggly beards. They were supposed to look like the stereotypical drug pusher. These people swarmed his property after the sun had gone down. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening, kicked in his door and began swarming through his house. And so Mr. Stewart did what any rational person would do in that circumstance. He grabbed a gun to defend himself. And in the course of the crossfire, a number of people were wounded, including Stewart and a couple of police officers. One of them, Jared Frankham, was killed. We don't know whether he was killed as a result of a shot that was fired by Matthew Stewart. We don't know if he was killed by so-called friendly fire, but he was killed. And now Stewart faces a capital murder prosecution that will begin, I believe, year from next month, April 2014, I believe, is when the trial is supposed to begin. Jared Frankham's name has been affixed to the public safety building in Ogden, Utah, and there was this huge funeral worthy, of course, of the internment of a Soviet bureaucrat or a chief commissar of the Soviet Politburo during the era of Stalin or Brezhnev. This happened in Utah as a result of a killing that was completely avoidable. In the course of enforcing drug prohibition. That's the sort of thing that happens when a police officer is killed, something that happens very infrequently, as you pointed out, Lew. It happens maybe 55 times a year. The trend has been going down dramatically over the last several decades, and yet you have this contrary example of people who are actually engaged in a genuinely risky occupation that enhances the quality of life for people. They were working in mines in Utah. And there has been some recognition of the fact that this is a human tragedy, but they're not going to have the survivors of the mining disaster victims brought to the state capitol and presented with awards. Their names are not going to be affixed to public buildings in Utah because these people were part of the private sector. They were not part of the exalted priesthood of government-sanctioned coercion.
Thanks to everybody who shops at Amazon.com. I wanted to mention that LRC gets a small commission at no cost to the buyer every time you go to Amazon through an LRC link, any of the widgets on the page for books or other items, or entering through the ad at the top left-hand corner of the front page. So thanks again, and it's a huge help. And Amazon, what a great company. It's just extraordinary. You don't need to go down to the local bricks and mortar place. You don't have to pay, in many cases anyway, sales taxes. So far as I can tell, virtually everything the human race produces is for sale at Amazon.com. So I highly recommend it. It helps keep LRC alive and growing. So thanks to all of you who shop at Amazon. I wonder how many people are victims of police gun violence every year or other kinds of police violence. There was just a case yesterday in northern Alabama of a cop who was chasing a young woman for a traffic offense. She ended up being killed in a crash between the cop car, he was not hurt, and her car. So there are those kinds of deaths as well. Do you know those statistics? How many people do the police kill every year?
Nobody keeps track of those records. There have been efforts made intermittently over the last 20 years, starting in the late 1980s, and there was considerable pressure brought to bear by police unions not to collect and publicize those statistics. And police unions, of course, are in the business of sanitizing the actions of police officers and ensuring that those who are actually involved in criminal violence against mundanes are insulated from the consequences of their actions. And so it doesn't surprise me to see that they're doing what they can to keep the public record bare and reliable statistics about the extent to which innocent people are victims of criminal violence, whether firearms related or otherwise, by police officers. I should point out that according to the most reliable tabulations I've seen, the number of SWAT raids that take place, those are fully militarized raids, usually conducted in the early mornings or late at night, and almost all of them having to do with nonviolent offenses. The number of SWAT raids that take place in the country every year is about 80,000. That means about 220 of those take place a day. That's happening here in the United States. If this were going on in any other country in the world, particularly a country that is ruled by a political elite that espouses an ideology we don't like, such as socialism or Islamism, if you saw that same type of routine paramilitary violence being carried out in any other country in the world, I suppose that the State Department would make that fact known to the public in one of its annual report cards on the human rights violations of other regimes. But that's something that's happening here in the United States. And it's worth pointing out as well that the purpose of SWAT teams, the advertised purpose of SWAT teams when they were created for domestic consumption back in 1968 by Daryl Gates at the LAPD, was to be a specialized unit for use in extraordinary circumstances, such as hostage takings, bank robberies, severe urban insurrectionary violence, things of that sort. And now pretty much every police department of any size has a SWAT team. Indeed, you might say that in many police departments, you simply have a number of conventional patrol officers and detectives who are part of a support mechanism for the local SWAT team, which is involved primarily in raids that focus on the use of or the sale of substances that are prohibited by the government, marijuana being the most conspicuous example. In the late 1950s, I recently found out, when the United States first got entangled in Indochina, there were prototypes of SWAT teams that were organized by military advisors in Vietnam. These were fully militarized nominal police bodies that were targeting people who were considered to be politically unreliable or just an irritant to the government of Vietnam. And that happened in 1959, as far as I've been able to tell. And it was about 9 years later that the SWAT teams were imported into the United States. Now, we have SWAT teams that have proliferated across the length and breadth of the country. What's happening is that these people are seeing their operating tactics and their equipment upgraded to the specifications of teams that were organized to conduct counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And you made a point earlier, Lew, about the fact that many of the people that were recruited into police departments now are combat veterans. They're given preferential treatment, as a matter of fact. There are all kinds of incentives that are provided to recruit combat veterans into domestic law enforcement bodies. Not only are you having people who are veterans of counterinsurgency warfare being given preferential treatment to become patrol officers in the United States, but the methods and materiel used in places like Afghanistan are now being increasingly adopted by urban police departments, carrying out their supposed mission of protecting and serving the public, when, of course, the real interest is to regiment the public and to ensure that whatever edicts are handed down from those who presume to rule us are accepted with proper docility by those of us who are ruled.
Will, is there good news? I mean, you do such magnificent work. There are other people, of course, doing it as well. Are Americans beginning to wake up? As any segment of the population, do you yourself see that people are getting more and more concerned about this kind of thing, or are they just docile?
I think that there's a growing movement that's difficult to quantify among people who are young liberty-minded adults, the same sort of people who gravitated toward the Ron Paul campaign, for instance, to examine critically what police are doing and to describe it candidly. Simply calling things by their correct names is a revolutionary act that I think has tremendous impact, rather than referring, for instance, to an incident of police violence as an effort to subdue a suspect or a fight or a brawl or a melee. An increasing number of people are referring to it as an assault and referring to police officers as assailants and the people they subdue as victims. I wrote an essay a few years ago in which I talked about something I call the Tom Joad Test. And Tom Joad, of course, was the character from The Grapes of Wrath, which is a novel I don't particularly like by an author for whom I have no particular respect. But he talked about sympathizing with people who are among society's downtrodden. And one of the things he said, and I'm paraphrasing now, is that wherever you find a cop beating on somebody with a nightstick, I'll be there. My question was, if you see somebody being beaten by a cop wielding a nightstick, with whom do you sympathize instinctively? If you sympathize instinctively with the guy wielding the club, then you're a statist. If you sympathize with the person who's on the receiving end of the violence, then you're an American, because the American premise is that the state has to justify itself. the state has to justify the use of violence and force and coercion. And actually, the American perspective is that the government's got no moral right to engage in aggressive force. The people who sympathize with the police officer in that scenario I've referred to as punitive populists, and unfortunately they're rather richly represented in the core constituency of the Republican Party. Those who sympathize with the person on the receiving end of the violence are liberty-minded, instinctive libertarians or market anarchists, just people who are concerned with the liberty and the dignity of the individual. I think the latter cohort is growing, and what's really encouraging here is that its growth is occurring in that segment of the population that is young and thoroughly disenchanted with the prescribed political categories that are supposed to govern us. They don't see themselves as being beholden to either end of the two-party cartel, the single party, the single establishment party with the two retail outlets called Republicans and Democrats really doesn't hold much fascination for them. And these are people who are using social media from YouTube to Facebook to Twitter to propagate this message that the state has no moral authority to engage in aggressive violence. And when police officers engage in aggression, they're just as bad as, if not worse than, their private sector competition. And I keep reflecting on Albert J. Nock's deathless insight that the government does not seek to suppress crime, it seeks to monopolize crime. And I think that there is, once again, a certain resonance that this has for a growing number of people who are politically aware today. And I think that's a very healthy development. As I said, it's really difficult to tabulate or to quantify that movement or to document how many people are actively trying to educate others about what's happening. But I do think that that's an encouraging trend, and it's having a measurable impact.
I remember in the Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn talks about how in the camps, the actual criminals, people who were, if we can assume the Soviet legal system was was finding actual criminals. The murderers, the robbers, the burglars, and so forth were the aristocracy within the camps, that the state felt a kinship with them as versus the political dissidents who, of course, were the scum of the earth. I wouldn't say the state is in favor of regular criminals, but the state doesn't feel threatened by the regular criminals as it does, of course, by anybody who disagrees with them.
Well, there's an affinity that you see not only in the Soviet example, but of course in the satellite regime in Cuba, as documented in Armando Valladares' memoir, Against All Hope. He noticed the same thing, that when he was put into Castro's gulag, that he was placed into a position subordinate to those who had actually committed crimes against persons and property. And you see the same thing happening here in the United States, which has the sprawling and metastasizing complex of penal institutions and probation and parole. The probation and parole system, of course, is designed to ensure that people get cycled back through this system, because there are many ways that people have successfully monetized and franchised the trade in human flesh that is prisons, probation, and parole. The thing that many people don't take the time to consider about our own system of so-called justice is the fact that we have the largest population of people in state detention in the entire world, and that this really bespeaks a failure on the part of our society. There simply aren't that many people who are incorrigibly devoted to stealing and committing acts of violence against other people who are in the private realm. This is something, once again, that crosses over that artificial distinction between private sector crime and the political establishment. We have, of course, a huge prison population, probably 80% or more of whom are people who have never committed an act of violence or fraud against another human being. They've engaged in some kind of behavior that the government has criminalized that is actually a vice rather than a crime. And once they're put into this machinery, they're acquainted with the criminal milieu, and they're given a set of incentives that will sometimes turn them into violent criminals. They'll emerge from prison and having no way of making a living. They'll end up doing things that perhaps do involve theft or fraud. And so they're put back into the system again to the greater glory of the state and to the greater profits of those who reap dividends from incarceration. And in that system, the system where we produce criminals out of people who are necessarily criminally minded, you have a hierarchy where the government will work with those we would recognize as criminals, those who are inclined toward theft and fraud, who become informants and provocateurs There are tens of thousands of snitches who are employed by the federal government. Heaven only knows how many informants are employed by state police and by local police and by county sheriffs for the specific purpose of inciting some behavior on the part of those who are targeted that can be prosecuted. And then it works sort of like multi-level marketing. Once you're brought into the system, you're told that you can get a downward departure, that is to say a reduction in your sentence, if you can find somebody else who can be enticed into participating in some kind of a narcotics transaction, or perhaps the grand prize, which is to get somebody to say something stupid into a microphone that can be perceived or depicted as a terrorist threat. And that's something that the Muslims in the United States are very acquainted with. The FBI for the last 10 or 12 years has been conducting a land office business in manufacturing phony terrorist plots. And now we're seeing a renewed emphasis on the so-called radical right in this country, the so-called anti-government movement, where the federal government and then para-governmental organizations like the so-called Southern Poverty Law Center are beginning to feed these informants and provocateurs into every gathering where there's an expression of discontent with the Obama regime or with the permanent regime that Bush was part of until Obama inherited it. They're going to be doing the same thing with anti-government dissidents who are so-called white right-wing extremists that they have been doing with Muslims over the last 10 or 12 years, and that's to create these phony terrorist plots and to create whole platoons of informants that will criminalize the actions of people who have not done anything to harm the public. That's how a totalitarian system operates, and we have in this country a type of low-grade, soft totalitarianism. It's not yet reached the routine depravity of governments that we've seen in places like North Korea or Cuba, but in terms of the claims that it makes on the individual and the methods that are used in order to enforce the will of the ruling elite, there really is no principled distinction between how these people operate and how their Soviet and Cuban and North Korean cohorts have operated. And we're seeing an incredibly rapid escalation on the part of the people that run the Homeland Security Department in terms of the acquisition of ammunition and the militarization of every agency of government that has some kind of enforcement capacity. These things are really potent indicators of the intentions of those who present to rule us, and we simply can't afford to ignore them.
Will Grigg, thanks for all you do to expose them, to help promote non-ignorance among the American people. And I agree with you that young people, Ron Paulians and others, see through the whole thing, whether it's everything from Social Security to the Department of Homeland Security. Everything named security is evil, by the way. But all these agencies, they don't trust them. They don't like them. They feel they're being ripped off. And, of course, we're all being ripped off. So thanks for sounding the alarm bell. Keep doing it. And thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Lew, thank you so much. God bless.
Thank you, Will. Bye-bye. Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the upper right-hand corner of the LRC front page. Thank you.